Today we're riding into the wild heart of Montana's past with Thomas Leforge, horse rider, a man who traded a settler's life for the pulse of the Crow Nation, galloping through battles, vision quests, and a world untamed. From militia mutinies to the thunder of Crow-Sioux warfare on Pryor Creek, his story stitches together the raw threads of a frontier teetering between chaos and kinship. So grab a seat and let's chase the echoes of a White Crow Indian's epic tale. This is the Big Fat Podcast and our They Gazed on the Beartooths series, where we dig into the stories that shaped our corner of Montana in partnership with the Museum of the Beartooths. If at some point you feel we've brought you some value, then go ahead, hit that like button, consider subscribing if you haven't already, and share this episode with your history-loving friends. All right, hey, good morning. Good morning, Cole. Good morning, Penny. We're back here in the studio.
Good morning. Halimba. It's Crow for good morning.
Look at you.
I know.
He came prepared. He's already speaking
Evidently.
Crow over there.
I probably said it completely, out of dialect, but...
Man, we just got one-upped.
We did, yeah.
Well, today we're talking about our man, Thomas Leforge. Tom Leforge. Leforgy. Lots of different names that he's been called, and also different spellings. I've figured that out. I've tried to search him and do different things, and they say apparently there's been different spellings for him as well. And then he was brought to our attention thanks to you, Penny.
My favorite book.
Is it really your favorite book?
It really is, because there's so much information about our area.
I can see why it's your favorite book. It quickly jumped into my top 5. I have a few favorites, I guess, and this is I can't number them. I can't really rank them, obviously, but there's 5 that come to mind, maybe. And Memoirs of a White Crow Indian. Is it Memoirs or Memoir?
Memoirs.
Memoirs of a White Crow Indian by Thomas Marcus. We're going to call him Marcus because that's how Montanans will simplify it. And I get it. It's a French name, and we don't want to try to sound like we're French. So we'll call him Thomas Marcus. Now, Thomas Marcus also wrote many books, but he also wrote a book with the help of William H. White, and that one is Custer, Cavalry, and Crows, correct?
That's correct. That's my other favorite book. I have a lot of favorites. They're just my number one.
Read that one yet. I've been dying.
I haven't read it either.
Yeah, I found it on Amazon for like $80.
Yeah, we were looking the other night, I think, weren't we?
Yeah.
And it was like $89 or like $96 or something like that. It was crazy expensive.
I bought the one for the museum for like 30-something.
Yeah.
Wow.
Several years ago, though.
Another book of Thomas Marcus's that I really enjoyed was Save the Last Bullet for Yourself. And that was his history, or his telling of the Battle of the Little Bighorn. And he went and lived with many of the Northern Cheyenne for about 2 to 3 years to gain their trust. And he explains in that book how, and what dedication that is for an author to go and live on the reservation, with these people. These were old timers in the 1920s. You got to figure it was, close to 50 years. I mean, these were guys who, if they were in their 20s at the time, they were in their 70s now. And he lived with them to gain their trust. And I don't blame them for not just trusting the first white guy that comes in. I know he wasn't the first, but here's a white guy who comes and all of a sudden starts asking, what was your role in the battle? And they had been dealt very unfairly at times, and I'm sure there was trust issues back and forth. So he lived with them and to gain their trust, and eventually they opened up. He says in that book that it came out over many campfires, slowly, little parts, little pieces. And anyway, he wrote that book, awesome book. That was my first exposure to Thomas Marcus. Apparently, he's also written another book that I also would like to read. I haven't read this one, and I'll ask you if you guys have read this or not. Nope, I hit the wrong key there. You know what? Maybe it's on that piece of paper that I handed you. It mentions on there that he wrote another book about I think it's a Northern Cheyenne who was at the battle, and it's his telling of the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Is that on that one?
I don't see it on there, but on the back of Memoirs, it says Dr. Thomas B. Marcus, Crow agency physician and personal friend of Leforge in his old age, is described by the present official tribal historian and ethnologist. Phew, tongue twisters this morning. Joseph Medicine Crow as one of the first and few white men to whom the Crows would speak freely. He also wrote Wooden Leg, a warrior who fought Custer.
That's it, Wooden Leg. Okay. And I believe that's another one I would like to possibly find. Now, Custer Cavalry and Crows was not originally called Custer Cavalry and Crows. I found a news article in the Stillwater News, or in the Columbus News, written by a Jim Annan, and he said, hey, Thomas Marcus was in town and stopped by the newspaper office today, and he was telling me about his new book that he's been researching and that he's going to be releasing soon, called such and such. I can't remember that title that he said it was, so I went and I looked for that book, and I was like, why can't I find this book? Eventually, I found where they said, somebody said no, that he had, it was going to be called that, but it eventually got changed to Custer Cavalry and Crows, which I thought was interesting.
Mm-hmm.
All these little dumb little things that probably aren't interesting to most people, but it's weird how we go down these little rabbit holes and we're like, oh, I just found something new. You know, it's a little thing.
Yeah.
So that's a little bit about the author, Thomas Marcus. Apparently he spent a lot of time here in this area interviewing old timers from this area, and I'm glad he did. He brought forward a lot of really good works. And I don't believe that was him that helped Bill Hamilton, though, because that would have been much earlier. So somebody else wrote or helped Bill Hamilton write his. Okay.
Yes, I believe so.
Okay. So Thomas Marcus, he wrote about Thomas Leforge. Thomas Leforge, his family came out from Ohio on a wagon, in a wagon train in about 66, I think. It was just the end of the Civil War. I could be off by a year or so there. Came out, and they were actually heading to the gold fields of Virginia City originally. But I can't remember exactly how they ended up not going there, but they ended up settling more closer toward Bozeman, and then eventually over on the Livingston side, they had a cabin there. And while they were there, they got their house burned down by Blackfeet Indians. A group came through, and he talks about this, about how they basically had to run out into the woods. The family got split up, and he had to swim across the river and to join up with other people. And I don't know, it was cold. Can't remember what time of year it was, but that water had to be super cold. And so they had some run-ins there. And then later on, when he was a member of the Montana Militia, 2 years later, they ran into a group of Blackfeet that they went through their camp, and they found remnants from his cabin. He's like, that's my mom's quilt right there. He recognized items from his house. And so he was able to tie the Blackfeet that they went and kind of had a little run-in with to the destruction of their cabin. So the family ended up moving back over to Bozeman, and that brings me to something I was going to bring up about his early life. Was he ended up joining the Montana Militia. So I got a little thing here I'll pull up. And is there anything I'm jumping ahead on? Is there something you wanted to share up front before I get into this? Wasn't there something that you had that happened in this timeline before this?
No.
Penny?
No.
Okay.
I think we're good.
Okay. Well, I found this newspaper article in the Boulder Monitor. Now, this came out on Saturday, November 5th of 1932, and it's interesting because it's an article written by Dr. Thomas B. Marcus, author of Memoirs of a White Crow Indian and a Warrior Who Fought Custer. So that would have been Wooden Leg, Warrior Who Fought Custer. Okay, there it was. I'm going to blow this up just a little bit so I can read this, but I thought this was interesting because it does talk a little bit about his early life and I don't know if I should read this whole article, but it's not too terribly long. Okay, this is Thomas B. Marcus. According to the recollections of Thomas Leforge, the first legal organization of militia in Montana was in 1867. Leforge had come with his father's family to Virginia City and then to Bozeman in 1864. Okay, so there we go. I was off by a year or two. The youth was 17 years old when one day, as he was riding into the Gallatin Valley village from the mountain pass eastward, he met two men who told him they were organizing a militia company. They were John Evans and a man named Griggs. They solicited the young Leforge to join them. He signed the roll then and there and took the oath they administered to him. He went on home to inform his parents before going to the militia assembling place. He lacked a few months of being 18 years old, the age required for enlistment. His parents denied their consent and threatened to abrogate his engagement, but he pointed out that he might be punished for perjury, so they let him go without further protest. The enlistment was for 90 days. So it goes on here to talk about kind of a little bit how crazy the militia was. The object of the militia body was to resist Indian raids, mainly their activities as horse thieves. Blackfeet were generally reputed to be the most offensive of the Indian pillagers. At any rate, they were on terms of open enmity toward the whites, and such killings as occurred were always attributed to them. But the friendly Crows, Flatheads, Nez Perces, and Bannocks were not looked upon as being guiltless of getting away with horses if opportunity came to them, or if they could create an opportunity without being discovered. The Gallatin Company of newly recruited militiamen assembled on the west side of the Bozeman Pass. There they awaited supplies. These were delayed in delivery. The men soon found themselves hungry and otherwise uncomfortable. They had only wild game. Food and no food and no arms nor horses, except, let's see here, it jumps ahead, except such as was personal property. In this condition, they were ordered to march over the mountain to the Yellowstone. They rebelled against this order, declaring they would not move until they had been properly equipped for warfare. Governor Meagher sent other militiamen and met the entire mutinous company, and put, the paper's crinkled right there, and put the entire mutinous company under arrest. The culprits were conducted to the top of the mountain where the Northern Pacific Tunnel now penetrates its crest. The governor was there at his temporary headquarters as commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Montana Territory. The militiamen already on duty were mainly from Virginia City and Bannock. The governor entered upon a scorching and threatening address to the rebellious newcomers. But the sympathies of the men in the other companies were with the recalcitrants. I love his vocabulary through here. Guns were slipped slyly into the hands of the recipients of the stern reprimand. One of these, known as Chris, took the lead in open defiance of the governor. He leveled his rifle at that highest commanding officer and told him he had said enough. Other rifles were immediately pointed in the same direction. There was no interference by members of the other companies. To the contrary, they uttered encouraging calls. "We are with you, boys." The trouble was soon settled, to the satisfaction of all concerned. The next day, the entire First Army of Montana were on their way to the Yellowstone. They were out hunting for Indians, or in fact, they were willing to encounter any sort of situation that might stir up what they considered life worth the living. Anyway, so there's a little glimpse of him joining that militia, and they basically pointed guns at the governor and said, "We're not going to take..."
Now, that should be Governor Marr.
Yes.
And I said...
Thomas Marr.
Okay, and I called him Meagher.
Yes.
Marr. Mm-hmm.
It's Marr.
Marr.
Okay, I apologize. Yeah.
There's a bar in Missoula called the Thomas Marr Bar.
Really?
There's a statue of Thomas Marr in Las Vegas.
I knew I was pronouncing that wrong, and I couldn't remember how it was.
Yeah, in front of Nine Fine Irishmen in Las Vegas.
9 Fine Irishmen.
There's a statue of him.
Wow.
So
he, while he's governor, has got his own militia. They point guns at him, and they said, "We're not listening to you. We're not going to take your crap." Anyway, it gives you a little glimpse of these rough characters. Eventually, not much happened. And after his 90 days, most of them had also deserted. And they deserted, and nobody went after them for deserting. Like, everybody just kind of wandered off, did their own thing.
Yeah.
They kind of got all fired up about nothing. But Thomas Leforge relates that he was one of the very few remaining that actually was there to be discharged. So he took his role seriously there. Another thing I thought that was interesting, they go on to mention that a lot of the guys that were part of that militia were pretty rough characters who were Kansas Jayhawkers and can't remember and basically Missouri bushwhackers that had and these guys were guys who operated on the fringes. They were not a part of the Confederacy. They were not a part of the Union Army, but they just looked to just jump anybody who was traveling along the roads in Missouri and blame it on the war. But anyway, so they were basic criminals he's surrounded by at this young age. Murderous criminals.
Yeah.
And I thought that part was fascinating there. Anyway, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it just, like you say, it just shows how a rough place this was.
Yeah, when people talk about the Wild West, I mean, this was
it.
This was everything,
Yeah.
Yeah. So LaForge says in his book that right at the very beginning, the first Montana militia was composed largely of ex-ruffians of the Missouri-Kansas border. As soldiers, they were utterly unruly. One company drowned its first captain.
Yeah, these guys were out of control.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It was wild. 1850s to 1880s in Montana. It was a wild, wild place.
You just kind of made up your own law on the spot, like your own version. That's incredible. So he joined that, and then afterwards he started to find out that he enjoyed the Crow Indians. He enjoyed spending time around the Indians there, and he goes on to be adopted then by
Yellow Leggings.
Yes, Yellow Leggings, and he explains how it wasn't uncommon, even if your parents were still living, to be adopted by other parents. And in fact, there was Yellow Leggings, and then there was another older couple, Crow couple. He was adopted by two, I think, Crow couples in the end, that they just had a lot of affection for him. They wanted to look out for him, and so he was there. And then during that time, do you guys have anything to add up during that time before I skip ahead?
Yeah, that's where he ended up having a Crow name too. Before he was adopted, they call him Fleetfoot or something like that because he was super fast when he was always doing foot races. But then he was able to ride a horse that the Crow kept getting bucked off on. Pretty wild horse, and he was able to ride that horse, and he said he never considered himself a horseman, but once he was able to ride that horse and essentially get it under control, they changed his name to Horse Rider, and that's pretty much the one that stuck through his entire life was Horse Rider.
Yeah, and they remembered him as that, even as an old man.
Yeah.
Huh. He was proud of that name. I mean, that was a cool name to have back then. That would have been cool. They could have thought up worse names for the white kid who was hanging out with them.
Right.
And that's actually where he met Mitch Boyer as well for the first time.
And so who was Mitch Boyer?
Mitch Boyer was a half Sioux, half white individual who, they say he knew the intricacies of this part of the country better than anybody. He was like the premier guy for guiding in this country.
And he spoke Sioux and Crow and
English. Mm-hmm.
And maybe even
did he speak a little French too, I think?
Blackfeet maybe too.
Yeah.
Because he was pretty important. He could understand what they were saying.
Yeah. Oh, and he was one of the premier hand sign language guys. Indian sign language guys of the area too. But he has a colorful history, and we see him later down the road as well. But he was one of Tom LaForge's best friends. And that's where he first met him, was over right before he got adopted by Two Leggings. They're yellow leggings.
And Mitch Boyer at that time was already married
Mm-hmm.
and I think he had a couple of kids at that time.
Yeah, he was
And
older. Yeah.
Okay. And here's a quick little trivia question here for you guys, all right? While I was doing a deep dive last night, I came across this. When was the first, supposedly, white man to have stepped foot in Montana? Around what year did the first white man step in Montana? This kind of blew me away. I found this out last night.
I'm gonna say it's got to be French trappers when they were part of Hudson Bay.
Okay. I'm not sure if they were
So-
Hudson Bay, but you're on the right track.
So French trappers.
Lewis and Clark.
No, before that.
Before that?
It's going to be before Lewis and Clark. I'm going to say French trappers, 1780s, 1790s.
So I cannot pronounce the guy's name. All right. It's if I can remember to throw this in here, I'll put his name up on the screen. I should have had this up. But 1742.
Ooh, I was way off.
Can you imagine that? 1742. A group
crazy.
of trappers came through. They started I believe they were up in Canada, but they came down through North Dakota and then headed west. They were trying to find a route to the Pacific it could have been the Hudson Bay Company. It was one of those companies. And there is, people do debate because there was not a really good record that was kept about all of this. So,
Yeah.
but they figured that he came into eastern Montana, southeastern Montana, near the Black Hills. So they said, because they report of him finding some shining mountains, and there's debate on whether he was talking about the Black Hills or whether he was talking about the Bighorns. But he supposedly came through eastern Montana heading west. And anyway, so 1742, that's kind of crazy to wrap
That
your head
is
around.
crazy.
Yeah.
That many years before our own, I related to the nearest thing, which would be the Revolutionary War. So anyway, so yeah, he hooked up with Mitch Boyer, related with that guy. He eventually got married. He called his wife Cherry, and he got a teepee and started to, around this time was when they started out with the first Crow agency over at Mission Creek. And did you have something on that?
Yeah, I do. Just kind of to set up a little more about the rough times and whatnot. So in this book, it starts out about, it's got a whole chapter at the first Crow agency, but this was actually in the chapter on the Yellowstone in the earliest 70s. It says hostile Indian attacks upon the old mission agency or upon someone traveling in the region were common occurrence after its establishment and until the military campaign of 1876 and the ensuing advent of the soldiers of General Miles and other commanders. Perhaps an average of once a week would be a fair estimate of the assaults on or threatening of the agency itself. The marauding Indians were Blackfeet from the northward and Sioux from the eastward. The northern Cheyennes were allied with the Sioux, although the Cheyenne tribe was much the less in numbers of the two allies. A few northern Arapahoes also cast their fortunes with these fighting Protestants against, I can't see this morning, white man invasion and what they deemed to be their country. The old feud between the Crows and the Sioux on account of the intrusions into the Yellowstone region by the Dakota tribe was accentuated by the fact that the Crows kept on a peace basis with white people while the Sioux usually were in open warfare against them. The Sioux fought not only the whites but every adjacent tribe who were friendly to the whites. As they looked at it, what we knew as friendly Indians were traitorous Indians.
Yeah, traitorous because they thought they were selling out all the Indians.
Right.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
it was wild times. I mean,
Yeah. Well, he talks about wasn't it shortly after he had his first son with Cherry this was at Mission Creek, and his cabin got shot up by the Sioux one night.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a regular occurrence.
in fact, he said that was a kind of a funny, crazy night because there's just some shooting. They were taking pot shots into the camp, and he had 2 portholes in his cabin or something, right? And that he could look through and shoot out of, and kind of wild. But a bullet came through one of the portholes, and hit a dish of cherries. It was a prized item, and I can't remember if it was a pitcher or some type of a dish, right? I can't remember. And it broke it, and Cherry was like, told him, she was like, "Oh, they broke my whatever," and then she says, "Kill them." And he just quotes her as saying this in the book, like, "Kill them," and then he goes on to say, like, "Well, I fired a few rounds from inside my cabin using my pistol, and then I went outside and I randomly shot a few rounds." And it was a lot of excitement. Nobody got hurt, and it's just another night.
Yeah, and it says Cherry was entitled, according to Indian custom, to count a coup because of her capture of an enemy's gun. So she actually went out there and got his gun.
Went and found somebody where they dropped the gun or something.
Yeah. And then Skookum Joe Anderson afterwards saw the body of the Sioux we had killed, so he had confirmed it. So Skookum Joe was one of the miners up at Old Nye City. So that's the other thing that's fun about this book is it brings up all these people
from our area. Tied into our area.
Absolutely.
And I don't know enough about Skookum Joe. I'm going to have to do a deep dive on him. I know he's in They Gazed on the Beartooths. There's a whole section on him.
A little later it says Jim Hughes, the agency freighter from Bozeman, was killed on the divide between the Gallatin and the Yellowstone. The Indians cut up his harness and took the horses and whatever wagon plunder they wanted. A man named Countryman and his son Dan were on horseback in company with Hughes. They got away without injury. Some of our people charged them with cowardice for their conduct. So here they're talking about Horace.
Yeah, our guy Horace. I live in Countryman Ranch, HOA now.
So then this next story I want to mention is not for someone that may have a bad stomach or whatever.
Hey, nobody's eating right now. Let's do it.
No, but we're not anyway. So Quivy, a white man, went with me one time to find the river crows. We came to them in Judith Basin where they were trading with a man named Dawes. When we were ready to start back, the trader gave us some cooked ham. We were very hungry when we went into camp the first night. In addition to the ham, we had with us some cold and hard biscuits and some canned fruit. We had no dishes except a frying pan. We located ourselves under the heavy boughs of a cottonwood tree, built a fire there, and started to prepare our supper. I warmed the cooked ham in the frying pan, then I put the biscuits into the grease and warmed them too. Quivy had begun to eat first, and he was pretty well along toward the completion of his meal when I began. It was raining, and drops of water kept falling into my frying pan. Notwithstanding the annoyance, I kept on at the work, and we exchanged some of his words in here. Felicitations on the toothsomeness of the ham and biscuit. Suddenly, plunk, an Indian hair braid fell into the frying pan. Investigation proved that we had built our fire exactly under a tree burial corpse. Quivy cursed and began vomiting. I became nauseated, but my food stayed down, even though it had been wet with dead Indian drippings. The sensitive Quivy continued sick the next day, and he cursed me because I felt all right. I promised not to tell, but it was too good to keep a secret. The Indians teased him, want some dead Indian, until he complained to the agent and gained his intervention. Quivy was the most profusely profane man I ever met. He was excitable, looked upon as crazy at times. If thunder and lightning came, he flooded the air with his profanity, tore up his hat, slashed his clothing, acted generally like an insane man. So you'd think he was pretty tough, but evidently not.
Toothsomeness.
Yeah, isn't it crazy though how Thomas Marcus wrote. I mean, the way they wrote back then, even the newspaper article in the 30s that you were reading, some of the words, I wonder if they were made up words or if they really were.
I would imagine that like a term like toothsomeness would have been an old, like that probably came right from Tom Leforge.
Yeah.
And I think some of the fancier words, who knows, I mean, would be obviously probably Thomas Marcus's vocabulary. But some of those descriptive things that they would do. They also they would use a lot of words to describe things. You know,
yeah.
They would be very descriptive, or I don't know how to explain it, but
overly. Sounds like sometimes I thought they were overly descriptive.
Yeah.
Trying to make them. I don't know if they were trying to make them sound smarter than they were. You know, by using all these words to describe something that could be described like in 3 words. I don't know.
You know, I've thought about that a lot, and I think that, you know, this is also the Victorian era.
Right.
While it's still the Wild West, it's also the Victorian era. And you go back and you see some of their writings and some of their things, and they just were. It was a time in the world where it was considered an art, I think. I think people really valued that. I think nowadays we're just dumbing things down so much. I don't know. Now it's just like we just want to dumb it down, and like now I see online all the time somebody's like, I don't understand this, explain it to a 5th grader, you know, or that's the thing, is like explain it like I'm in the 3rd grade, or whatever people write. You know, so we were losing that ability to
see. And that was something, I mean, I'm reading these old books that I've been diving into. This one, Yellowstone Kelly's memoir, a lot of them, just the way they write back then, and they use the big words and a lot of words to describe something small. It's fun to read those and see how they, you know, like, did they have conversations like that too? Like if we were having this conversation in in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, would we speak like they write?
I would think they would.
Yeah.
I think, betcha those guys around a fire, that was part of the fun of it, was to talk in those roundabout circles and be very, use a lot of big words.
Trying to be very eloquent.
Yeah, like a poetry to it almost.
Yeah.
And then you had to like read between the lines or something. Almost like how cowboy poetry of today does kind of the same thing.
Yeah.
In a way. I don't know. Not that I'm a huge cowboy poetry connoisseur, but from what I've seen. Okay, enough already. How can I support this wonderful little museum in Columbus, Montana? I know that's what you're thinking right now. Visit the gift shop. 2 things happen when you do. 1, you can finally find that right gift for your brother-in-law's birthday that's coming up. Number 2, your purchases directly support the work of the Museum of the Beartooths. 2 birds, yada yada. All right, let's focus. No, that's an awesome story right there, though, about the drippings. That's intense.
Yeah, and the way they write too, they don't leave anything untold. I mean,
no.
Yeah, I wonder if there was more though. You can kind of read between the lines during that whole.
More than just the Indian hair braid.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
You wondered.
So it wasn't too terribly long after that, because the first agency at Mission Creek was only there 4 or 5 years, and then they started to seek out a new agency location. And it says in here, a new location for the agency was decided upon. It was to be on the Stillwater River, just above the mouth of its Rosebud Creek branch. The boundaries of the reservation had been diminished by treaty agreement, and the old agency location now would be in white man land. Preliminary surveys for the Northern Pacific Railroad had been made along the Yellowstone during the previous summer, the summer of 1873, under the military escort of Generals Stanley and Custer. Cherry and I and our son Tom would live at the new agency. Tom? That was the name I had given him. But he had another name conferred upon him by the Indians and altogether used by them. According to his mother and all of his Indian relatives and acquaintances, he was Takes the Pony Whip.
Takes the Pony Whip.
Takes the Pony Whip.
Oof.
So wasn't it Tom Leforge and Mitch Boyer were tasked with essentially finding where they built the agency, right? When it was down here.
Yeah, it could be. I just marked that one.
Yeah,
I've read that as well. Now, before we go to that, I want to go to an event that happened before they actually moved out there. And this would have been because when was the second Crow Agency built?
It started 1874.
Okay. So,
And he was says, the railroad is 1873. So, yeah.
Okay, so right around that time.
Yeah, he set out in 1874.
Okay, so right around that time, 1870. I think it was in 1873.
Is this with the battle?
Yes,
it was
he was
1873 on Pryor Creek.
On Pryor Creek, and
Yeah.
I was going to tell you a little bit about this because I think it gives a good glimpse into his observations on just Crow culture. And some of those things, and not just Crow, but the Sioux and American Indian cultures, how they also dealt with each other here. I found this story fascinating. Let's see here. Okay, and this is he was out actually with Mitch Boyer, and I can't remember what they were originally out to do, but they were out here, and I think this is when they might have been out looking for the next location, actually, if I remember right, leading up to this, of the next Crow Agency. But in a roundabout way, they start to get the feeling that there's Sioux nearby, and then they see some Nez Perce, and they kind of find a whole bunch of Crow. It says, and so it leads all up to this battle between the Crow and the Sioux at Pryor Creek. And I just highlighted some places here. Hopefully I won't take too long to read this here, but it says, about 2,000 Crows and 200 or more Nez Perces set up their lodges in the same half circle at the mouth of Pryor Creek, most of them on the west side of the creek, the opening of the horseshoe being on the south bank of the Yellowstone. Here they prepared themselves for the expected onslaught of the Sioux. Women dug rifle pits, most of them outside the lodge circle, but some of them inside. Men put their guns and ammunition into good order, overhauled their war bonnets and other paraphernalia of mortal conflict, arranged their paints for ready use, made their medicine. Horses all were brought in. Many of them were put upon an island in the Yellowstone and guarded there. No fighting this day, but there was a continual uproar of heralding and haranguing. Nobody slept much during the succeeding night. I was wakeful, but I believe I was not afraid. We had a good supply of rifles, needle guns, and ammunition. Our warriors appeared anxious to fight. We had chosen our position. Still, the number of oncoming Sioux exceeded ours. By how much, we did not know. We could find out only by waiting. So this is interesting. He's sitting here watching them. This is preparations between the Crow and the Sioux for battle. And I think many times I've read about a bunch of like white people or cavalry guys or army guys who are getting ready to fight, and maybe they have some Crow with them, and they will give you observations of how maybe the scouts or who was with them were preparing some of the things they would do, because I've read a lot of things like that where we're talking about either the scouts that were either with Custer, those guys, or the scouts that were with General Crook. But this is interesting. This is not a bunch of U.S. Army guys going into battle and they just have a few Indian scouts with them. This is Indian families. Like there's wives there. When they went to war, they had their families with them a lot of times, So I thought this was interesting that he got to see them preparing to go to war not against whites or not yet. This is American Indians, tribes going against each other here. And I just thought this was fascinating. He says the Sioux appeared the next morning on the distant bluffs and on the valley below them. Criers were going among them. Warriors were galloping here and there. They were organizing for the attack upon us. So I imagine criers are people who are yelling out commands, or stuff to pump people up as well, to give them confidence. Okay, to me it looked like an immense throng of them. Our chief Blackfoot put his soldiers, his regular army policemen or dog soldiers, out upon a side bench there to be held in reserve as a home guard. He ordered me to go with them, and I went. So I didn't realize this before, but he got kind of sent, like, you stay over here, stay safe, stay with this group. We're only going to use you if we really, really need you. So they're kind of trying to protect him, or do they think he can handle it? I don't know. You know what I'm saying? So he ordered me to go with them, and I went. Many old men were there too, all just remaining there and awaiting orders. So when he mentions many old men, that's why I'm thinking, okay, we're trying to either protect you or we don't know how well you'll do. So our Crow warriors were doing their medicine, each according to his own way of imitating the vocal noises and the actions of his own special animal friend, which he believed protected him in time of danger. There was a tumultuous mingling of woofing like a bear, talking like a magpie, howling like a wolf, screaming like a curlew, hooting like an owl, mimickings of the sounds and movements of a crane, a badger, an eagle, an elk, of many varieties of lower animal life. Isn't that interesting? That he's witnessing these guys all.
Yeah.
They're taking on the characteristics of their favorite.
Of their spirit animal.
Their spirit animal.
Yeah. Which I think that's one of the things I loved about this book, is that he really gets into the native culture and how the Crow way of life. Because there's the other one. I know you're talking about the pre-battle with the Crow and the Nez Perce, but like him and Mitch would even go into the Pryor Mountains and go on vision quests, and he was often invited into sweat lodges, and so he really adopted the Crow way of life.
Yeah.
And he's very descriptive about it. And that's what makes that's what I think makes this book such a treasure. Because it's not somebody from the outside looking in. He lived it. He was, for all essential, a white Crow Indian. That's the name of the book, but
how it was accurate.
Yeah,
very accurate.
Very accurate.
Yeah.
And he was and just like that, like the cries of a curlew. Do you guys know what a curlew sounds like? Have you been out in the spring? Do you even know what a curlew looks like?
I've never heard of one.
I know what a curlew looks like.
They'll start showing up here in about the next 3 weeks. Long-billed curlews, and they'll be out north, out in the prairie. They're about the size of a sharp-tailed grouse, a little bigger, and they have this beak that is about 4 or 5 inches long, maybe even longer, some of the full-grown adults, and it's tilted downwards, and they make this really weird caw sound. It's cool. I'll have to take you out and I'll show you, because I know exactly where they nest. I mean, they're all over out north.
Wow.
In the spring, but long-billed curlew, yeah, and so I can picture that very easily about how they would, get into that spirit animal and start making those noises.
Wow. That's incredible that he was able to, witness all this preparation. This is not stuff, I don't know, that I don't think many people have seen. He says, I was wearing, dangling from my long black hair, my red plume that had been given to me by a medicine man. Yes, I believed in it as a helpful charm. My clothing was but the trousers and moccasins. My body and face were painted in true warrior fashion. I was mounted bareback on a white horse having red ears. Interesting, he remembers all these details of what he was wearing, what the colors of things were.
See, and I just think that, again, that goes to show how important this was to him and how much he believed in it.
Yeah, 100%. And he makes that statement, yes, I believed in it as a helpful charm.
Mm-hmm.
He was all in.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I'll jump ahead here. I could read you the whole book, but I'll jump ahead a little bit here. He says, when the Crow warriors began riding the daring line, I left the regular dog soldiers and joined the fighting front. So he's told to go, hey, you go be safe over here. We'll go, you're in reserve, And the daring line. Yeah. And I thought that was interesting. They called it the daring line.
And you see that throughout the whole book. He was an adrenaline junkie. Because there were multiple times where he was like told, you need to stay back or you need to hang back here. And he's like, nah, I'm going to the front.
Yeah.
I want to be right in the middle of it.
Yeah.
So.
And it explains kind of what the daring line is, so I won't go into that. It's going to explain that. Pretty Eagle, a dog soldier chief, and a great fighter, ordered me back. I returned, but soon I was again with the active warriors, so he snuck back in there again. Man after man would gallop his horse along in front of the array of Sioux, shielding himself as best he could by riding on the animal's side, while the enemy sent bullets and arrows toward him. So they're all just taking turns. They're facing off, and these guys, that's the daring line, is they go out there and they run this line in front of the enemy and expose themselves to whatever they can shoot at them. Then the Sioux, in their turn, would give us a return game of the same kind. I rode the daring line, although I admit having been prudent enough not to pause or to get too close to the other side. But how it thrilled me and put courage into me. To be on horseback and in danger is a choice situation in life if one can measure exactly his limitations. So how intense would that? I mean, he's out there between these two tribes. We're talking there's 2,000 Crow. There's a lot of people. There's 2,000, over 2,000 Crow.
And he said there were more Sioux.
And there was more Sioux. This is a huge group of people. This is a huge event. And he's not only witnessing it, he's partaking in it. And he's reveling in it. He's wallowing in it.
Yeah.
You know? Okay. So he says, the dares on foot began to be put into operation. An Indian of first one side and then the other would walk out toward the enemy, would take his position on some little eminence, and there he would announce his name and utter defiant or tantalizing remarks. This feature of the game also aroused in me a desire for emulation. I moved out, thoughtfully, restraining myself from too intimate an approach. So in other words, not too close, and called out the warrior challenge. I am horse rider, a white man. My home is at the agency on Upper Elk River. Elk River was the Yellowstone, the Crow, and the other Indians all refer to it as the Elk River. Yes, we know you, somebody answered back in English from the Sioux assemblage. And an instant afterward, a bullet sang its mournful tune somewhere over my head. So somebody's like, hey, yeah, we know you. And then a bullet goes right over him. I wanted to run right then, but pride and my knowledge of the inaccuracy of marksmanship and the feebleness of the bullets at that distance prevented me from committing this sort of mistake. So he stood his ground. He's like, these guys are not good shots. And I'm just going to go ahead and do my thing here. I thought that was fascinating that he wanted to take part in that, and they'd heard of him. The Sioux had heard of him, even at this age. They knew who he was.
Yeah.
So it jumps ahead here, and we'll talk about what were the women doing. The women of both sides were in the rear, or were in the near background of their respective fighting men. They joined in the scornful defiances. So they're yelling back and forth, too. They're trash talking. Our women cheered us when we did something worthy of notice, and they sang their strong heart songs to keep up our courage at all times. At one time, I felt a full glow of personal pride when our women sang, "The horse rider is with us, and we shall get the scalps of all the Sioux." Nevertheless, I sang the death song when I went out to stand and challenge while being shot at. So he went out and sang his own death song. So the battle starts, and eventually, let's see here. I lost my little place there. Whoops, how did I lose my place? Okay. The battle starts, and then eventually they could tell that the Sioux, they started to fire just a whole bunch of guns. They started to just fire a bunch of guns, big volleys, lots of volleys, and they realized that the battle was about over, that these guys were just kind of throwing up a big burst of what they had, and then they were going to pull away.
Yeah.
So the Crow were like, no, we're going to go ahead and pursue these guys. They're leaving first. That means they're losing. We're going to chase after them. So this is interesting because they start to go after them. Pretty soon the Sioux are basically in now full retreat. They're starting to drop items and drop weapons, and they can't grab all their stuff, and it turns into a rout. And so he starts to witness things that just kind of, these are more things that he sees here that I wanted to bring up. I went 4 or 5 miles in the pursuit. I saw some conduct that I did not like and that I never shall reveal. Crows were taking scalps, counting coup, grabbing guns from each other for a second coup count. So they were handing each other's guns off for a second coup. In other words, they'd probably come and tapped a body with a stick, but then they wanted to count coup with borrowing their friend's gun. They would then shoot a body to count coup a second time, is what I'm taking from that. I counted some coup merely to adapt myself to the situation. Our Crow women, that's funny how he explains that. Our Crow women were following the men, cheering them, and well, they were helping in ways that the old-time Indian women were taught to help in exterminating enemies. I saw one Sioux who evidently was in great agony. His scalp was gone, and he was groaning as he groped about on hands and knees. He crept into a ditch. I mentally prayed that he might die there without further molestation. So through this, he has still empathy and compassion for the Sioux. He's witnessing all of this. I mean, this is just what they do. I'm sure there was a lot of mutilation going on. There was a lot of basically how they show disrespect to each other at the end of a battle. The pursuing Crows came straggling back that evening, that night, the next day. A few of them followed the Sioux all the way to the Bighorn River. The returning ones all had horses or other plunder. This had been the most extensive battle between Crows and Sioux since the advent of guns among them. 40 years or so before this time, they had met in a terrible conflict near Pryor Gap, 25 miles up the creek. In this earlier encounter, the weapons had been bows and arrows, spears and knives, clubs and stones, with only a few, if any, inefficient guns. So he's kind of showing how momentous this really was of an occasion. This is not they had lots of little skirmishes, but this was a big deal. This was a big event. This is one that people would sing about and talk about around the campfires for decades, this type of an event that he was there for. So then they start to head, and they're going to head back to the agency. This is still at the Mission Creek Agency, and so they send riders out ahead of time to let them know, hey, we're coming back. And this kind of just tells a little bit of that return and what that was like. I got a big name among the Crows for my part in the battle and in the incidents precedent and subsequent to it. At the Diving Water. Oh, this is interesting. At the Diving Water River, the Boulder River, where Big Timber now is situated. And this is why I wanted to read this part, because it kind of puts these places that into, you can picture. Where Big Timber now is situated, we stopped and camped for a council. Chief Blackfoot sent for me to come into the conclave lodge. He said, tomorrow you shall go with the first warriors into the agency. Some young men already had gone on ahead as couriers, according to custom. But Blackfoot had reference to the formal return of victorious warriors into the home camp. We chosen ones blackened our faces. This is a token of revenge accomplished, and that the war spirit was now dead. This is a token of revenge accomplished, and that the war spirit was now dead, like burned out coals. We rode at the head of the straggling procession of more than 2,000 red people, their travois, their horse herds, their dogs. The mourners stayed far behind or aside, as was the fashion. We, leading ones, rode abreast into the agency village. We sang songs of victory, and we fired our guns into the air. I believe that General Grant, parading at the head of his army after the Civil War, did not feel any more important than I did in the vanguard of this Indian homecoming. Shot in the jaw, led my horse, with me mounted upon it, about the agency and the lodges of the Indians. He heralded my great merits and sang songs in praise of me as he walked along and stopped at various places. I received many gifts, and of course my Indian relatives had to give away lots of presents to show how good they felt because of my high standing among the people. I thought this part was really neat. I wanted to share this part because once I found where old Fort Parker was and where that agency was, this telling now, I can go to that spot and picture this event of them parading him around, and he's not speaking of it as in, hey, they did this, like he's an outside observer. Everything is we. This is what we did. We did this because of this. He explains it as we blackened the faces because we had accomplished revenge, and that he says something there as that the war spirit was now dead, like burned out coals. So he's explaining that these were not just their things. This is, he is a part of this with them, and how proud he was to be a part of all of that. And so, anyway, I thought that was really neat, because now I can't wait to go the next time I drive over there. And you can get off at that exit, go to that spot, and be like, here was this fort, and here was this valley that these people were coming up through here.
Yeah.
What an
and
event.
have a vision yourself of what that was like.
Yeah, 2,000 people come straggling in here, and then there's people in mourning, there's people in celebrating. What a huge event that was. It wasn't just a normal, we had a little skirmish. This was a huge, event that only happened every maybe once or twice every 100 years.
40 years prior was the last big battle
one
between the Crow and the Sioux.
Yeah.
According to Leforge, yeah.
Yeah. So, anyway, I thought that was just a really neat little telling of that. And then they get put over there. We got to relocate, and they go to the Second Crow Agency. Take over, Penny.
So I'm glad you said that he said we. It was everything we, not I or whatever, because right at the beginning here it says our new agency was named Absaroka. It was located a mile or so up the Rosebud Creek from the present white man town of Absaroka, and about 2 miles from where the Little Creek flows into the Stillwater River, or the Buffalo jumps over the Bank River, according to proper rendition of the old Indian designation for this stream. Mitch Boyer and I chose the exact site after it had been determined to set up the reservation headquarters somewhere in this vicinity, since in the course of our duties as dispatch carriers and our travels as hunters, we had become well acquainted with the local geography. The agent detailed us to this special duty of finding the best position for his official home. The stockade was the first important construction because trespassing and hostile Sioux Indians were more numerous than they had been around the mission agency. The stockade was of adobe in general character, like the structure we were abandoning 60 or 70 miles to the westward. Inside the stockade were the offices and stores. Log cabins as places of residence were built outside the vicinity of the adobe stockade. The agent had a 2-story log house. All of the others were single-story. $80,000, if I recollect clearly, was the amount appropriated for expense incurred in moving the agency from the old site to this new one. So this is an 1878 map drawn by the agent at the time, Agent Frost. And it just kind of gives you an idea of what things look like.
So this is basically a copy of his drawing, but that's his writing. That's his.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
So the agent
agency.
quarters were right here.
Okay.
On this corner, you can see there's a doctor's office. There's a schoolroom, a council room, a store.
So maybe kind of with your hand, kind of direct where the highway is sitting right now. You need 3 more hands for what we're going to do here.
So the highway is basically right over the top of Dobbytown.
Okay.
And these were the small cabins that were mentioned in the description. I'm going to move this down a little bit. Over here is the slaughterhouse.
Okay.
And the irrigation ditch. And the irrigation ditch runs along here, and the highway's right here. And this is still called the agency ditch today.
Wow.
That ditch that runs across the highway there, or along the highway. So next, let me pull out a photo here. So this is actually a photograph that of a painting done by George DeForest Brush, and it was says right on there, to my friend Hugh Campbell. For a long time, this was the only image that the museum had of the Second Crow Agency. So you can see on the right side, there's the 2-story section with a chimney sticking up. This is actually a really good painting. It almost looks like an old photograph,
But from what side do you feel like we are looking at the fort?
Well, this is Butcher Creek in the foreground.
Okay.
So it'd be looking west.
Okay. Okay,
Yeah.
so it would be, okay, I get it. It would be for, like, if you were out on the highway, it would be to the east of the highway. If you were on the highway, like, you'd be looking back toward the highway. You'd almost be, like, from behind it if the highway was the front of it.
Yep, the highway would be on the other side of these buildings
Okay.
in this, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and this is actually, I've seen the original now, and it's in color is absolutely stunning. It's not a very large painting because it was painted on a cigar box lid.
Oh, wow.
So on the back of the cigar box lid, it says Old Crow Indian Agency, Montana, 1883 on the rosebud.
This is the actual cigar box, huh?
Yeah, yeah. And the actual painting, you can see the cigar box lid on the back. They've framed it in a way so you could see both sides.
Wow. That's great.
Yeah. We'll just keep showing a little bit of show and tell before we get back into the book. Then we Patty Molinaro, a friend of mine, she's done just an amazing amount of research on the Second Crow Agency, and she was up in Helena looking at the Frank J. Haynes collection. And Frank J. Haynes was the photographer for Yellowstone Park, so he would stop along his way on the train from Minnesota, where he lived, to Yellowstone and take pictures. Well, he happened to stop and go take photos of our agency, which is amazing to me because, like I said, we only had that photograph of the painting. So here we have the employees.
Which actually kind of shows a little bit of a testament to how significant the agency was, that he would go
do that.
Yes. Like he would be like, hey, this is worth, I mean, you didn't just snap photos like we do with our phones today. You just, anything and everything.
Right.
No, you were very specific about what you were shooting. So this needed to be, this was significant, I would say.
Yep. And he must have been there twice because I believe the date on this photograph is 1877. And then we have some others that are 1883. But this one is Agent Keller, and I'll just point out Agent Keller's sitting right in the center.
Okay.
This may be his wife. Not entirely sure. We know she was here for a time, but didn't like the Wild West and went back east.
What was wrong with her? I mean,
right?
Who didn't love the Wild West?
Yeah.
This may be the teacher. We're not exactly sure. But then we have Colonel Norton.
Ah, there's our guy.
And this is the other interesting thing is here we are with a photograph done in the 1870s, and here the photographer's putting things in their hands to hold. So we're, Norton, he's holding a carpenter square. Did he help with, repairs of the buildings or maintenance or whatever? And I don't recall all the names of everyone, but the guy in the middle, in the back, is Tom Shane.
Tom Shane.
That Shane Creek, Shane
Creek.
Ridge, everything is named for. He was married to Sarah, who was also a Crow woman. Don't know who the blacksmith is, but
I think I see Horace Countryman.
yep, Horace Countryman
And,
is there.
He
Which
is,
is-
point him out. He is 2 to the right, I think. Right there. Yep.
Yeah, and so if this is an 1877 picture, the reason we might not know the name of that blacksmith is because 1876, Leforge was
The blacksmith.
the blacksmith until he became chief interpreter and the go-to guy for the scouts for Bradley.
Ah, that is interesting.
So this guy replaced Leforge as the blacksmith.
Wow. That's interesting. Good
Because in
catch.
1877, they were still chasing the Crow and Cheyenne.
Or the Sioux and Cheyenne.
Or Sioux and Cheyenne. So he was still with the cavalry
Ah, that's interesting.
when
Good
this
catch.
picture was taken.
Yeah.
Yeah, very good catch. So then this image is of a scaffolding burial of a Crow person. And what's interesting about this one is you can see some buildings back there. So here's another image that shows the agency main compound.
Oh, wow.
And this is the only image that shows Town. The small
Wow.
cabins.
Yeah.
So that was really another exciting piece.
I've seen this image many times, and I guess I haven't really looked so much in the background. I'm glad you pointed all that out.
Yeah. And then this image, so this is on the west side of the highway where the Crow were camped, and they may have been camped in other areas too. But I'm going to point out this guy right here is actually Colonel Allen.
Haha. Wow.
And Medicine Crow is actually in that image somewhere too.
What's interesting is I can picture right where that is. If anybody ever visits right there, there's a pull-off with a historic point sign right there.
Yep.
And that's right above that little area right
Yep.
there, looking
Yep.
down to that river bottom.
Yep. And then also there's more scaffolding images. You can barely see the mountains right here. Steve Arberg, the archaeologist for the Second Crow Agency site, he had taken current images of all of these and then faded into the old image or vice versa, which was amazing.
Wow.
Then this is more burials. So this is right next to Butcher Creek.
Okay.
So when we were looking at the map, Butcher Creek was at the bottom. So this would be across Butcher Creek from the main compound. So
And there's actually, it looks like a white picket fence there.
mm-hmm. And you can see a headstone down here in the corner. We know that the doctor died while working there, and they buried him, and there was a couple of soldiers and whatnot.
It's interesting that there's a teepee right there, though.
Yeah.
I wonder what that was.
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and tell you that story. And that's really kind of a fascinating story because there's...
We set this up earlier.
You did.
She was like, bring up the teepee.
Yeah.
Okay, because that was going to segue me into that. No, I didn't know
Gonna
that.
make him want to know what the teepee
No, I'm
is.
glad I pointed out something you're going to go to, because now I was like, man, I wish we could know what was up with that teepee. Go ahead.
So when Patty and I were in the archives of the Montana Historical Society in Helena, we were looking at the journals along with the images. And Frank J. Haynes, like the employees' photograph of all the people, it was labeled the employees at the agency or whatever. And this one is named the cemetery at the agency, and then there's one image of just the teepee with a little bit of scaffolding on the burial on the right side. But if you look close, you can see there's a scaffolding burial here, and when you zoom in, you can see barely one on this side as well. You probably won't in this image, but anyway, this one is labeled the grave of a Blackfoot chief.
So is that Chief Blackfoot?
Well, that's what Patty and I came to the conclusion
Because why would they
why would they bury? Because first of all, if you're buried in a high teepee, this is a place of honor. So why would they bury a Blackfoot chief?
Just wrote that down wrong.
Yeah, and Haynes didn't understand, I'm sure of it. So anyway, we believe this is Chief Blackfoot of the Crows, which we have mentioned in our reading.
When did Chief Blackfoot die?
So,
because he was at the meeting
yes,
with Bradley and
yes,
when they got the scouts in April of '76.
So I cannot remember his name, but I was told by Tim McCleary, who's the cultural anthropologist at Little Bighorn College, because I brought this up to him right away when we found these, and he was so excited and everything. Anyway, he showed a copy of an official document that was to the, I don't remember what the term, Interior of Indian Affairs or something like that in D.C. And it was Agent Keller signed it. So it was 1879. And I can't remember the exact date. I should have brought that with me. But it's Keller writing to D.C. saying that the distinguished Chief Blackfoot, a.k.a. sits in the middle of the land, has died and wants to be brought back to the agency to be with his kindred.
So would this Haynes picture be one of the 1880 trips?
1883.
1883, I
trip.
believe. So
Okay.
that paper that used to be packed around in the back pocket of a Crow man, he always thought it said 1874. And so he thought Blackfoot was brought back to Fort Parker or Mission Creek Agency. But Keller was not an agent in 1874, nor
Right.
was he an agent at Fort Parker. So it was 1879. So we're all pretty sure that this is the grave of Chief Blackfoot. And we could go on and on and on about this story because there's much more to the story, but Google Chief sits in the middle of the land or Chief Blackfoot, and you'll hear a whole story
Wow.
about him.
Look that up. So you did ask me to watch the time.
Maybe
we
we
should.
need to do a part 2 because we haven't even gotten to the artifacts.
Yes. Let's
Okay.
do a part 2.
Okay. All right. Well, this one's been fascinating. I didn't want to cut in here because we're right in a zone. It's hard to come back into that zone. So, okay, cool. We'll do this
Thank you.
again really soon.
Yes.
All right. Thank you for joining us in this episode of the Big Fat Podcast, an hour that gazed on the Beartooths series. Keep in mind, the next time you stop into the Museum of the Beartooths, the museum is a private, nonprofit 501c3 that operates solely from generous donations from history lovers like you. So look for the receptacle in the lobby after you sign in and drop some bills to help pay the bills and keep history alive. And you can always show your support by leaning into that like button, subscribing if you haven't already, and sharing this episode with your history-loving friends. We'll see you next time.